So we've now come to the fourth and final panel. I am not going to introduce the chairperson. So Cherian is chairing this. We have heard some metaphors, in the last 1.5 days. So Cherian started with his popular culture metaphor, greatest hit. And then earlier in panel 3, we heard hoax buster. So I just want to use a sports metaphor here and talk about how fake news is basically throwing a curveball at journalism. So essentially, this panel would focus on, what journalism or journalists should do, especially in an era where fake news is proliferating, this information is rampant, and increasingly it seems that people may be quite okay with fake news. So I would like to invite Cherian on stage, and he will introduce the panel and the speakers.
Thanks very much, Carol. Let's get started straight away with Alan Soon, who is familiar to most media professionals in Singapore and increasingly to the region. You can read his full bio in the packet. He's currently the CEO and founder of the Splice Newsroom, which I hope he will tell us a bit about. He's also known to Singapore news audiences as heading Yahoo. I guess it's in a previous incarnation. And if I'm not wrong, at one stage, Yahoo News was the #1 news site in Singapore, ahead of the mainstream media. Maybe you can share some of your secrets there. Sorry? Probably still is, you think so? Okay. So Alan, without any delay.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to do something slightly different. I figured that because I'm coming up here at the end of the day, and when we've had all these great conversations already in place, I figured it would probably not be appropriate or even adequate for me to try to do a presentation here. But what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about what I've been seeing in these conversations that we've had in the last, I would say, this whole debate around fake news has been around since probably earlier this year. The one thing that I wanted to bring to the table here was to have a discussion around where this leads our industry. If there's one thing that is missing in the conversation that we've had today around fake news, is the question around what is the role of media today? Mainstream media, as some people will call it. Now, I think the inconvenient truth here is that you can't talk about fake news without talking about quality media. Then that's one of the conversations that I feel has been missing in today's agenda. And I hope, when we get the panel up here later, we can have some really good questions and answers to that. You can't talk about fake news without talking about what mainstream media looks like, sounds like, feels like. You can't talk about fake news and misinformation when people are not out there listening, watching, reading what we used to know as mainstream media. And I think this is something that we need to pay particular attention to. So while we've had a lot of discussions around how hoaxes come about and how they get distributed and the economic models around these things, we really haven't spoken very much about the state of media as a whole. If we were to take a closer look at where we stand today as professionals in this industry, we're ultimately talking to a very small group of people who obviously care about journalism, but the fact is, for the most part, we've lost touch with mainstream society. We would call ourselves as mainstream media, but at the same time, do we represent mainstream society? I think that becomes quite debatable, especially in a year like this. The question that has always been at the back of my mind is, if truth doesn't sell, then what does? And I think this is one of the key questions that we need to tackle as we talk about misinformation and fake news. So this is an inconvenient truth that I feel like in a room of journalists and editors and highly esteemed colleagues, you know, this is one of the conversations we never want to have. We never want to ask ourselves why we're in this state to begin with. What have we done or not done in this process of moving from, you know, traditional publishing models to a digital model now, which, you know, in many ways has cost us our livelihoods. What would it be like, have you thought, if we were to optimize for trust and optimize for a real relationship with our readers and viewers and listeners? What would that look like? How would our models and the way we work be different if we didn't have to chase after clicks, if we didn't have to chase after scale, if we didn't have to chase after reach? The way we engage media will be very different. The way we engage our audiences will be very different. One of the concepts that I try to teach my clients when I'm doing consulting work is this whole concept of who is your customer. We're all very used to talking about audiences as media professionals. But, you know, when we talk about audiences, we tend to talk about 18 to 35, mostly female, mostly university graduates, mostly on mobile. You know, we talk about features and we talk about traits that we know exist because that's all we track. We don't spend enough time talking about who these individuals are. And one of the problems that we've seen in the industry is that as we pushed deep into page views as a key metric, we've lost touch with what it means to actually build a relationship with a customer. So instead of talking about audiences, what if we were to just say customer? Because that's a word that we all understand well. What if we were to ask ourselves, if this person was my customer, what could I do to better engage them? How would I inform them? How would I know that I'm actually doing my job when we say that we're out here selling the truth and talking about truth? How do we know that if our customer finds our information useful? Can they act on it? Are they able to think about it deeply? Are they able to make something of it? I think these are questions that we need to ask. And if we're not asking ourselves that as media professionals, I think we'll continue to see a decline of this industry. And again, you know, we go back to the first point I made here. The uncomfortable truth in all of this is that people are more likely to just look at fake news and just accept that, even though we have a whole industry here that is out there purportedly to put out the truth. And I think we need to have some conversations around how we look at our customer. What is it that we're trying to serve? What is it that we can help them answer to understand better? How do we inform them? How do we make this space a little bit more inclusive? The ways that we've worked over the last few decades, you know, those days are over. And I think if anything, 2017 has taught us that until we understand our customers better, we will never be able to move this forward. So with that, I wanted to just get that out and on the table. I feel strongly about this stuff, so hold me back if you need to. But you know, I really want to have a great conversation around this. I've seen some really and heard some really great questions out here today. So I think, you know, we've got quite an afternoon ahead of us. So with that, thank you. I'll be back.
Thanks, Alan, for being very brave and leaving more time for completely unpredictable Q&A where you will be grilled to give us the answers and not just the questions. You know, one of the great pleasures of being associated with the Asian Journalism Fellowship for me personally was the chance to be exposed to journalistic excellence in the region. Yeah? I think too many of us in Asia tend to, you know, for geopolitical or whatever cultural reasons, we tend to associate excellence with, you know, certain countries in the West, often overlooking the fact that there's just incredibly superb work in the countries around us, and it's been personally, you know, so energizing and stimulating for me to every year meet more and more journalists and organizations in Asia that you know, remind me how much inspirational work is going on within 3 hours flying distance of Singapore that I think most of us are just oblivious to. One source of that inspiration is, of course, the Philippines, which has produced exceptional ventures like the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism and VERA Files, which has in turn spawned the VERA Files fact check. So it's extremely, I was delighted to know that, a person who is associated with all these three organizations would be coming here to speak to us. So Yvonne Chua, come and inspire us with the Filipino formula for maintaining optimism in difficult times, shall I put it that way?
Hi, everyone. I think the downside of being one of the last speakers is most of the speakers who went ahead of you have spoken or said what you want to say, huh? But the upside is you can always turn this into an opportunity to recap and maybe synthesize and repeat what they said. I told Carol that I'll play the role of an optimist in case some of us are falling or have fallen into a spiral of despair because of the proliferation of fake news. But also, just so that I don't get into an argument with anyone over definitions, let me just use the term misinformation or disinformation or alternative facts, as Cherian Conway uses it, to refer to a range of falsehoods that can, from false claims, misleading claims made by public figures and by, in the medical world, to outright fake news, huh? Let me just start that many of us journalists easily fall prey to misinformation and become purveyors of misinformation because of certain vulnerabilities in the profession. The pressure to be first, the pool of stories imbued with the news values oddity, the tendency towards sensationalism, the obsession with ratings, metrics, analytics, and of course these days the inescapable dependence on social media are among our weaknesses. Propagators of misinformation know full well what these vulnerabilities are and know equally how to exploit them for ages now. We all know that. But I'd like to think that inherent in the practice of journalism has been a long-standing set of principles that has contributed to its resilience. Over the decades, journalists have come to some form of understanding as to the ethical standards that should guide our work, as we seem constantly caught in the grip of misinformation, bad and sloppy journalism, media ownership and survival issues, and the never-ending challenges of technology and platforms, the printing press, radio, camera, television, and the internet. We can see some of the most important journalistic principles espoused as early or as far back as the mid-19th century. So like Farish, I like 19th century readings. The Times of London in 1892 listed what it said should be the duties of the journalist. 1, to seek out the truth and to present the truth as he can attain it. 2, to perform his duties with entire independence. And he needs press freedom to investigate truth and apply it on fixed principles to the affairs of the world. Truth-seeking, truth-telling, independence. These are age-old principles in our practice. Add to the list fairness and accountability. So in the fight against alternative facts, perhaps we need not look too far and too wide for guidance. What we need to do is to not lose sight of these principles. These principles have kept journalism going before, they are keeping journalism going right now, and we hope they will keep journalism going as the onslaught of misinformation is expected to escalate. From what are clearly journalism's functions as a discipline of verification and sense-making, have arisen such genres as explanatory journalism, and investigative reporting. Though they're not exactly young, these forms of journalism are enjoying a surge in many parts of the world. Some call it a second coming, largely in response to the amplification of misinformation in the digital environment. These are tools journalists should seriously consider adding to their arsenal, if they haven't done so, to help them ferret out the truth and to help them enlighten audiences on how truth is being suppressed or distorted to reinvent reality. The quest for truth has led many journalists to further increase the rigor of their research to collect evidence to buttress their reports, including debunk fake news or falsehoods. Thus, we have witnessed the rise of data journalism as institutions and technology place more data at the disposal of the public and of journalists. The exponential spread of alternative facts on social media, however, demands a faster response. Consequently, journalists in many parts of the world are joining hands with other sectors and are turning to post-hoc fact-checking and verification of user-generated content. Many newsrooms have long had fact-checkers who would look at the copies of reporters before they see print or they go to air. Post-hoc fact-checking refers now to verifying the claim after it has been made, published, shared, or disputed. That's the kind or the new form of fact-checking that we are referring to. Only a few years back, the discussion in the news media revolved largely around the skill set journalists need to acquire to develop to stay afloat and relevant in a multimedia world. Now we are looking at yet another range of tools and learnings. Post-hoc fact-checking, for example, is easier said than done. It has, in many ways, changed the way we work as journalists. At VERA Files, where we have been fact-checking false and misleading claims of public figures for more than a year now, we have had to modify the way we do journalism when we fact-check. Next week, we go into a planning workshop, this time to figure out how we will fact-check fake news. Our challenge is to go behind fake news and not just say what's fake and what's real. I'm sharing the details of our methodology. It shows the elaborate steps we take to help ensure that each fact-checked item is airtight. You will see that the statement or statements that we fact-check must come from the original source. We don't even believe in mainstream media unless we have triangulated what they share with us. The claim has to be verifiable, meaning it can be supported or disputed by facts and facts alone. The sources of evidence must be chiefly primary. This includes diving deep into data sets and even scanning academic studies that journalists are not used to. We need hard evidence. The fact check undergoes scrutiny, intense scrutiny. The fact checker is fact checked by at least 2 other fact checkers before the copy goes to top editing. And one of the biggest challenges is how do we make the fact check item easy on the eye and easy on the brain? So the format is important. Infographics we use widely, and we also produce video to go with our fact check items. As we do all this, we strive to adhere to the principles not only of journalism, but last year the International Fact-Checking Network came up with a code of principles for fact-checking. Non-partisanship, transparency of sources, of funding, of methodology, an open and honest corrections policy. The demand for transparency of sources, for example, means anonymous sources in fact-checking are a big no-no. We list the sources not only within the text, but even after the text, so it reads almost like a bibliography. That's rather unusual for a journalistic output. So it's really strange for even us journalists to be doing that, but it's possible. And we have a lot of help. The good news really is the path to learning for journalists is paved with help these days. The digital environment has made it easier for journalists within countries and regions and across the world to network, to share resources, and even provide help to thwart threats to the practice. Groups such as the GIJN, the ICIJ, First Draft, IFCN, and data journalism networks make good use of technology for these purposes. Media development in Asia and elsewhere around the world continues to enjoy the support of various institutions, foundations, academia, development agencies, civil society, and yes, even governments. There are new and old faces. The new faces include technology companies, the giants among them. Many of us are now familiar with what Facebook and Google are doing to help keep journalism and the truth alive through tools, products, and services. There are many others like them. For example, San Francisco-based NGO Medan, was instrumental in helping 34 newsrooms in France carry out the cross-check project. Their tool, the check program, is also now being used by journalism students in the University of Hong Kong. Trendalizer was deployed in the UK elections by fact-checkers. We've developed plugins to help journalists and fact-checkers flag fake news sites or to verify videos and images. Despite all these wonderful developments, Asia seems to have some catching up to do, especially in the field of fact-checking. The fact-checking sphere has rapidly expanded. More newsrooms, including the New York Times in February, are hiring full-time fact-checkers because fact-checking is increasingly being viewed as one of the means to help media regain the public's trust. Around the world, the number of active fact-checking sites and projects that meet the criteria set by Duke University, and that includes nonpartisanship and the frequency of fact-checking, has grown threefold to 126 as of the end of June this year. There are 9 active sites or projects on Duke University's list that are from Asia. 1 in Southeast Asia, that is VERA Files Fact Check. 2 in Southeast Asia, 1 in Nepal, South Asia's Check, the other in India, Fact Checker India, and the rest in East Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea. They are too few and far between, especially if we take into account that the continent consists of 48 countries and is the most populous in the world. With a population of about 4.4 billion, it means that there is only 1 active fact-checking site for nearly 500 million people in Asia. There is much to do. But beyond building their capacity to pursue fact-checking and other genres of journalism, journalists, as important, need to show communities the crucial role they play in society, particularly in a democracy, and their relevance in a post-truth world. News literacy, let me stress, not just media literacy, but news literacy is not a new concept. Yet only a handful of newsrooms or journalists take an active part in that endeavor, conveniently leaving it to the school system or civil society, or taking interest only in news literacy campaigns when they equate to increased circulation, ratings, metrics, or bluntly, more dollars and cents. We have a lot of rethinking to do. For who better than the journalist to help school the public in discerning the news? And who better than the journalist to make that convincing argument that society does need journalism and journalists? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yvonne. Our final speaker this evening, Charlie Beckett from the London School of Economics, Department of Media and Communication, comes from a traditional media background, BBC and Channel 4 of ITN, but he's evolved into an authority on the impact of the digital revolution on journalism. He is the director of a new body, the LSE Truth, Trust and Technology Commission, which I'm certainly curious to hear about, and I hope you will have time to talk about. Charlie will be trying to draw in this incredible amount of wisdom and insight that we've gathered today, and hopefully put a cherry on top and give us the answers that we are looking for. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks for that. You never told me I had to do all that stuff, and the cherry as well. It's a real pleasure to be here, partly because I don't know much about Asian journalism, so the last day and a half has been a fantastic education for me. I've been hugely impressed and at times inspired by the conversation that you've had and the, some of the examples that we've seen of how people are trying to improve information and journalism. As Cherian says, in a sense, I'm glad I'm the last person, partly because I'm not holding up the next speaker, but also because it allows me to sort of reflect back right indeed to what Cherian was saying last night. Obviously, as we've heard at this conference, fake news is a real problem in all its many forms. It misleads citizens, it misrepresents reality, and it causes damage to the information system itself. And it also helps foster, it's not the only cause of it, of course, but it helps foster a kind of culture of mistrust, of cynicism, of relativism and confusion. And these are all antithetical to the idea of journalism. And of course, as we've also heard today, it could get a lot worse. Firstly, because we've heard, because governments and other, powerful agencies are starting to deploy fake news or misinformation themselves. They're kind of weaponizing it. And of course, many of them have got greater resources than, for example, the news media. Secondly, again, as we've heard, fake news is very innovative. It can exploit new technologies and channels such as closed messaging apps, for example, where lies can spread undetected. But for me, I think that the biggest danger is that we are not going to appreciate that fake news or hoax news or hyperpartisan news, that these are actually symptoms of much deeper systematic problems in our information ecosystem. So we've been talking about solutions for fake news, but it cannot be solved, certainly not in the short term. We've got to get used to the idea that this is now a kind of endemic condition of our increasingly mediated and complex lives. So we do need to address, the structural challenges and opportunities. And, the last speech from Yvonne talked about opportunities that fake news presents. But the structures are changing profoundly, and so must our solutions. And I think we need to think again about some fundamental ideas. We've heard people talking, for example, about what do we mean by reasonable or reasons, or what do we mean by objectivity. And I think one thing that's been slightly missing, perhaps until Alan's intervention and perhaps the last panel, we haven't really thought about how journalism itself really has to change to cope with these new realities. In the short term, fake news is actually good news for journalism, partly because it's been good for the mainstream media business. We've seen with American news organizations, their ratings are soaring. More importantly, it's kind of reminded the public, if you like, of why there's any value in decent journalism. But I still think that there are some big questions that we should all be asking ourselves. Now, as Cherian mentioned, this autumn, I'm going to be leading the launch of a new LSE commission. It's going to convene a bunch of stakeholders from tech, from journalism, and from civil society who are going to ask some of those questions. And the idea is in a year's time we'll publish a report which we hope will set out an agenda for truth, trust, and technology. At first, it's going to be reporting on the UK scene and referring to Europe and America, but the idea is we're then going to roll this out as an international project, and we would love to network with yourselves on that process. So I want to have a quick look at those three concepts: truth, trust, and technology. First up, truth. And I think we really have to, there's a bit of an assumption that we do know what is true or factual. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what is truth, especially for the public, when we live in a world now of such diverse opinions and increasingly of subjectivity? Are we really in a post-truth world, or is it really a multi-truth world? And I think that could actually be seen as a rather good thing. Surely it's great that people are expressing greater diversity of opinions and thoughts and feelings. But I wonder, is journalism good enough at understanding and explaining what's happening in that complex world? Perhaps the real problem, as people have mentioned, isn't just the fake news, but it's the overall overabundance of information and sources, and of course the pace at which that information flows. There's this rising tide of facts and opinions that are brought constantly and immediately right into people's lives through these intimate, especially mobile technologies. So in the face of all that, perhaps it's not surprising that people are increasingly relying on instinctive and emotional responses to consuming and, of course, sharing news information. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what can journalism and other information producers do to bring evidence, informed analysis, to where the public are having those conversations and where they are getting their information instead of expecting them to come to us? Now, fake news is popular partly because of the lack of trust in the news media. Now, we in the news media were never as trusted as much as we thought. And that's partly because, obviously with the exception of everyone in this room, that's partly because the news media has been as fallible, biased, and unaccountable as the so-called fake news merchants that we like to criticize. So a key question should be, how can we build journalism credibility? And I think to start on that process, you have to redefine what you mean by trust. It should not mean blind faith. Deference is over, hello skepticism, and I think that's a good thing. Trust should not mean either that I trust a source that I agree with. Trust has to become a relationship that shares the process of understanding. The cliche that it's more of a conversation than a lecture. And key to this, of course, are transparency, but also interactivity. You've got to show your sources, you've got to admit what you don't know, you've got to find better experts, and you've got to listen to your audience and act with greater humility and engagement. And the one thing we've begun to realize, especially from our experience recently of elections in the US and the UK and from the Brexit vote, is that mainstream media is pretty much out of touch. It doesn't reflect the variety of views and experiences of people as they live their lives in a world where, as Cherian was mentioning on Friday, I think, where a combination of globalization, technological change, societal shifts have reconstructed the way that they live and the way that they communicate. And I think that despite some of the advances that we've seen as newsrooms have modernized, we've got a long, long way to go before we really understand and reflect the diversity of the publics that we serve. And of course, trust isn't a given. It has to be earned every day. In a world where we rightly encourage skepticism, we've got to be as critical of our own conduct as we are of others. Now, to the last word, the technology bit, and it was great to see two of the tech people on the stage just now. Technology, I think it's really important to remember that social networks people love. People love the internet. People love the functionality and the potential that it's given to their lives. We've got to remember that. And sure, it's also enabled and amplified fake news. But we've got to ask, can journalism use the digital tools that's going to create the relationships that connect that public to the reliable and relevant information and debate? Now, around the world, we've seen newsrooms are going on new platforms such as Instagram and Snapchat to reach the public. But are we doing that just to chase advertising and revenue, or is there a strategy involved when you do that that's going to sustain your brand's quality as well as your income? Alan mentioned audiences and audience data. And again, there are too many examples of digital companies who see audience data and personalization and engagement just as marketing devices rather than a way of building a sustainable relationship. I've got no problem with competition. I've got no problem with profit. But we see all around us digital innovative news organizations failing because they haven't understood the place they have in people's lives and how they can make that long term. Very quickly, by the way, can I just take an extra 30 seconds? Who here, the journalists, have ever looked at audience data about their work? Yeah, that's not good enough, is it? How many people have ever looked at comments on articles about their work? You know, really looked. And you've all gone, oh shit, haven't you? Yeah, I know. And then you've never looked again. Anyway, so I think the key question for those networks is, can they facilitate a healthier digital public sphere? They say they want to, but can they do that, for example, without compromising on the value of the open internet? Google and the rest of them are facing increasing pressure to remove offensive, dubious, or disruptive information from their networks. They're already changing their algorithms to try and promote good content and steer us away from the bad stuff. But how much do we know about the principle that these platforms are acting upon? Do we really want them to act like publishers? Do you really want Mark Zuckerberg to be the editor-in-chief of the world's biggest information distribution system? So if you don't, then you really have to ask yourself, what's going to be the relationship between those platforms and what you might call the publishers? Both of them need to put the public first so that the public can have the trust, and so those publishers and platforms have the trust to create a sustainable and credible information marketplace. And we've got to do that before the politicians intervene. So we're hoping to use our Truth, Trust and Technology Commission to at least set an agenda for addressing those issues. At the moment, I think too many of these conversations are siloed in different sectors, in different countries, and we're not really having that conversation together. My answer to most of the questions I posed is that the news media should not abandon some of those traditional journalism values. Journalists have got fantastic skills in processing information, and some of them at least do have ethical and political values that we need to sustain democracy. But I really do feel the answer is not to return to some mythical model where journalists are the gatekeepers of some kind of myth of objectivities. I think that we need to go with the grain of human nature on social media. We need to think much more about the human and political as well as the technological reasons why bad information is so popular. We need to use that audience information, the data, to understand what they're interested in and to serve them personally with content that's relevant, but also content that is stimulating and even challenging. So to counter fake news, We need, of course, good journalism, but I think we need a reinvented journalism. We need to make journalism part of the emotional as well as the material lives that citizens now lead, partly online. It's not enough just to make good journalism or to fact-check the fakes. We need to find new ways to engage and inform a whole new generation of citizens. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much to the speakers for kicking us off in this final session. Let's throw the moment open to questions straight away from the audience. Anyone? Yeah.
Hello. Hello, good afternoon. This is Aki from Malaysia. Yeah, thank you for your sharing. I want to know, because I'm from the print media, the newspaper, I would like to know whether, in your point of view, whether the newspaper going to be extinct one day. So if we still have a hope, or we definitely have to move to the print media, the news media. Thank you.
To digital media?
Yeah, digital media,
Okay,
correct.
could I have a couple more questions before we return to the panel? Yes.
Hi, my name is Vikhar. I'm a journalist from India. This is for Professor Beckett. In your presentation, your suggestions were very valid, but I'd imagine that we need to reimagine journalism, and for that to be possible, you are assuming a great degree of cooperation between several media organizations, corporations, and while there is a crisis in media, some have still been making money. So, I mean, it seems slightly not feasible, the suggestion that you're making of free, because everyone needs to cooperate, right? So that's not going to happen, so.
Okay.
I mean, correct me if I got it wrong. So.
And Gunnar?
Good afternoon. My name is Gunaraj Luitel. I am from Nepal. Earlier, we used to talk about like we are not only citizen, because once we started using online medium, then we started talking about netizen. So, being a netizen, we should have like netiquette. But the line of netiquette is blurred. That is why this kind of negative or fake news phenomena is over. Don't you think so?
Okay, shall we return to the panel first? And Alan, do you want to take the first question on whether newspapers are going to die?
I like that as a first question, Aki. I think that's very provocative. You know, the short answer is we've seen this decline in newsprint. We're talking about newsprint in particular here, right? Over the past 5 years, especially. I think in a lot of countries, this is consistent. I think what has really changed has been around the way content has been created, the way it gets discovered, the way it gets distributed, right? And that's where some of the big behavioral changes have taken place. But you know what? Media is not broken. The stuff that's really broken is the business model that goes behind that company and the way it works. And I think this is where it gets interesting for a lot of people, especially, you know, for someone like me. I think this is where the conversation is. The conversation is around what can we do about business models? How do we better understand our modes of revenue, our cost structures? How do we respond to a customer that has a different way of consuming our content, you know, because of phones and because of, you know, other competing technologies in this space? And I think that's where the conversation gets interesting, and I think that's, you know, you know, maybe that's something we can talk about later if there's time. But it is a long conversation.
Can I elaborate on that? Develop that question to ask a supplementary one, which is that, does it matter if newspapers die and are replaced by other forms? And I guess what's behind in my mind is I'm wondering if either digital or broadcast or any combination of any of the above is at that stage where it can provide enough newsroom jobs to, say, sustain quite specialized beats, which tends to be now associated with newspapers, right? I mean, I think in most countries, it's only newspapers that have, for example, full-time, say, transport correspondent, full-time health correspondent, or even more micro beats. And that seems to be what's lost when you transition to digital broadcasting. I mean, would that be right? So does it still matter that newspapers survive, or will journalism necessarily be compromised? The kind of reliable news that we are looking for, will it be compromised if newspapers die? Charlie, do you want to take that?
I mean, in the short term, it matters because newspaper print is still, you know, in a market like America and the UK, it's still, for most brands, the majority of their revenue. But no, of course it doesn't matter. And increasingly we have a generation coming through who do not care where they get their information from, as long as it's good information. How you organise that, I think, is a more profound question. Strangely, only one newspaper in the UK has actually died in the 10 years, despite us, you know, constantly thinking that's going to happen. Where I think there's a more profound shift is going to be that news brands that used to try and do a little bit of everything, and they do a lot of general news, which is remarkably similar to the stuff that other people create. There is so much duplication of that kind of news. I think that is going to get shredded. And so you are going to see smaller newsrooms, or you're going to see a lot of people, we've already seen it, go to any newsroom and they're, you know, about 20, 30, 40% of the old jobs have gone, and perhaps 10, 20% of new jobs have been created. And sometimes they've been created outside the newsroom. People are hiring third-party agencies to do fact-checking or specialist services and so on. So I think the old idea of the monolithic brand all in one physical space, I think that is going to dissolve. But at the end, it doesn't matter. We're not about saving a particular newsroom. We're about saving journalism.
I think the second question was for you as well, Charlie. Right?
Yeah, I might have expressed myself badly. No, I don't believe in collaboration between news brands particularly. I'm a passionate supporter of competition, actually. Competition can be, you know, deleterious when it drags people down, but generally it's good for journalism. And I think the same applies to the relationship between the so-called publishers and the so-called platforms, that you have to be very realistic that, you know, Facebook, for example, doesn't really need much news to make the amount of money that it does. And so you have to be realistic about how that ecology is going to evolve. But I do think that we as a society have a mutual interest. This is ultimately a political question, which is, if as a society we care enough about news, then we're going to force the platforms and the publishers to find some kind of system where journalism survives.
And I think the third question has to do with citizens become netizens, and what is the netiquette that is required for societies to survive and not kill one another. So do you want to take that?
I wish we had an anthropologist here, but you know, that's one of those types of questions that I think I'm probably ill-equipped to answer. Yvonne? No?
Okay. We're going to pass on that.
I'll just quickly on the netizen thing. I don't know if I've understood it, but you know, like the citizen journalist thing. Has anybody in this room ever met anybody who said, when you've asked them at a party, what do you do? They've said, well, I'm a citizen journalist, actually. It doesn't exist. I think, you know, we use that word netizen to sort of describe people, but people never describe themselves as a netizen. We, all of us, are citizens. We are all using the internet. We just do it in different ways. And I really do hope the lines are blurred, because that makes for a much more creative, competitive use of, you know, digital technologies.
Ari, you had a question. And
Hello, I'm Ari from Indonesia. So my question is for all the panelists. So it's interesting. Charlie said about journalism, or the media must invent journalism, or we must reinvent journalism. It reminds me of the debate between Glenn Greenwald with The Intercept and the editors of the New York Times. I remember that I think Glenn Greenwald's trying to reinvent journalism by you can actually express your opinions, you can be opinionated, you can take side, you can be partisan, and then that's in a way that's Greenwald's way to engage the readers. And I think he has a point in a way that the New York Times is still one of the most respected media in the world right now. But then the New York Times is also the icon of the old-fashioned journalism that the millennials will probably find boring or too serious and probably out of touch. And I think that's the issue right now. I mean, many newspapers, many media in the world, I think in Indonesia, Jakarta Post itself still see the gray lady as a role model. But then that's actually old-fashioned journalism. While we know that like the younger people, like the millennials, they want, let's say, Vice News. Vice News produce like really cool, slick videos about the right wing, the riot in Charlottesville, and also about ISIS. I mean, that's the problem, and it's the new audience is different right now. The new generation is different. So my question is, how should media reinvent journalism? How could they find a new way to present messages that can engage the new audience that is completely different from the generation in the previous generations? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay. Jay.
Hi, I'm Dennis from the Philippines. We've heard a lot excellent presentation from esteemed panels for the past 2 days, but least we forget, the main challenges right now is the social media attacks. Journalists, crusading journalists, face great challenges now for being critical to the government, criticizing policies that are, inhuman. Educate, for example, extrajudicial killings in my country is one main problem. I guess Ma'am Chua would attest to this. And journalists face online threats. Maybe I haven't heard from any of the panels talk about how journalists can deter or protect themselves from online attacks. Anyone from the panel?
And Edson at the back. Yeah.
Hi. So I think Charlie stressed in his presentation the need for mainstream news organizations to build trust. How would you reconcile that with research that is finding that people are getting their news from sources that they do not necessarily trust, and that credibility is no longer no longer brings the numbers that traditional news organizations need?
Sorry, they're getting the news from
sources that they don't necessarily trust.
that they themselves don't trust? Or?
Yeah. That credibility is no longer a currency. That they may rate something that's credible, but they don't really get their news from that side. That credibility no longer matters for audiences.
Right. Okay. The first and the last question, I think there's an overlap. It has to do with this interesting question of whether the old adherence to objectivity, and neutrality really does serve today's audience, who may in fact want more attitude, coming at you from a stronger point of view that that audience relates to. Any or all of you would like to answer that?
I think this is a very important topic, especially with, like I was talking about, the need to serve a customer. If we were to think of this as media being an advocate for a specific constituent, what would that look like? And how do we make sure that we're serving that one person or that constituency or that certain group, that certain interest group better. I think it's critical that media takes an opinion about what is going on in the world, because if you don't, someone else will. And that stuff is more compelling than you wanting to be objective. I think your job as journalists is to go out there and tell the truth and describe it the way you see it, but not to try to be objective to the point where you're not taking a stand and, what is the term that's being used right now for this? Reporting from nowhere, was that the term? And I think that's something that, as an industry, we need to be very cautious about. For decades, we've allowed ourselves to hide behind this veil of objectivity and never taking a stand and never actually saying what we think is right.
Yvonne?
Should we reinvent journalism? I think maybe the first question we should ask ourselves is, are we doing good journalism? Are we, right? Are we doing the things that we're supposed to do, that the profession demands of us? So that's more fundamental for me, is to ask ourselves, are we doing, right, what we're supposed to do, what our profession, our practice expects us to do? And from there, once we know that we've crafted our message, then we have to adapt, of course, certainly, the tools, how to engage the audience. And I know that it's difficult in a social media world where the demand to go viral stares us in the face. It can be a very lonely, it seems like when nobody listens to you, it feels lonely. But it also sometimes brings me back to the days when we didn't have social media, but we had dictators all around Asia who also didn't, and nobody wanted to listen to the truth. But we still had to put it out, good journalism, so that maybe one day, or years from now, decades from now, it will result in something. So these days when we engage in fact-checking, I'm a journalist of 36 years. And I know what it feels when stories don't get read, when people ignore you. And it's still the same right now with fact-checking. Not all pieces go viral. And I always just draw comfort from what Aldous Huxley said when he wrote about dogma, that facts don't cease to exist because they're just ignored.
Right.
So just keep doing good journalism, adapt, make it engaging. It might not reach the audience you want right now, but maybe in another form, another day, many years or many decades from now, it will reach the audience. Huh?
Can I push you on that? You are a journalism educator in the Philippines, I guess top communication school at University of Philippines. When you are trying to sell this tried and tested model of journalism to a current generation of would-be journalists, do you sense any generational shift that they are, in fact, don't quite see the point of this this form of neutrality, that they would, in fact, prefer their values to be more front and center, to write with more attitude and personality?
My university is a center of excellence in journalism. So we're very fortunate that the students we draw have that passion for the truth and for journalism. I think the frustration, however, they face is when they leave the university and have to work in the real world, when there are no opportunities to do good journalism that they've learned in school. And that's where the gap comes in. So that's a bit sad.
Charlie?
Yeah, I'm a bit more optimistic. I mean, I think first of all, I don't think it's a sort of choice between the New York Times and some other kind of more trendy journalism. When we think about millennials, for example, they're not from another planet, okay? Millennials have sex, they want to earn money, they'd like to perhaps, have a family and have stability and go for a meal. The evidence, certainly the anthropological evidence I've seen for Europe anyway, is that they're remarkably similar to everyone else used to be at their age. And they, in fact, I think, consume more news than any other generation ever has. Now, they may not always do it, they may not always subscribe to the New York Times. It may be that, for example, they subscribe to Teen Vogue. Now, Teen Vogue is fantastic if you want news about fashion and acne, but it also does superb pieces on things like Syria or abortion or racism. And I think millennials, if they're distinctive, it's like all of us, that we're all having a much more blended media life, that we don't park the serious journalism over there and the lifestyle, personal journalism over here. It's much more mixed up, and it's mixed up, of course, partly by social media, but it's also because that is what our lives are like. And so I think I'm actually quite optimistic about the new generation coming through, and I don't think we ought to put up barriers which say, here is the national park of quality journalism, and over here is the sort of popular stuff that doesn't really matter, because we're all human beings and all this stuff does matter. Very quickly on the trust point, or the credibility point, I think you've got that the wrong way round, I would suggest. The point is that people, for example, say Fox News overall has low trust ratings, but for people who watch Fox News, it's got super high trust ratings. I personally think, having just commissioned a commission on truth, trust, and technology, I think the trust word is very, very dangerous. If you ask anybody, do you trust the media? What's their answer? No. You don't want to look stupid. But do you trust the news source that you read? Yeah, of course I do, because I'm sensible enough to go for a credible news source. So I think we have to be very careful about how we talk about that.
Let me just jump in with two observations from there. I agree completely with the skepticism which we should look at trust surveys. And Edelman, the PR firm, does a global trust index or something. Right. And it's very interesting. They find that among the countries they survey, the citizens with the most trust in their media is China. Yeah, and I think followed by Singapore. No, not followed by Singapore is the same rank as the Netherlands, in spite of having, being worlds apart on, say, any press freedom index. So if you look at China having a much higher trustworthy media, according to its citizens, than most other countries, the conclusion I come to is that when you ask a question about trust and people give you an answer that they do trust the media, it could either be because the survey respondent has been so successfully brainwashed by an untrustworthy media that they consider the media trustworthy, or that the media is inherently trustworthy. And it's really impossible to tell.
And
which
conversely,
is which.
you'd prefer it if you weren't in a society where there was zero trust for all news media, because that would
Exactly.
similarly make you think there was something catastrophically wrong with the whole system.
Yeah. There was a question right here. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. Before you jump in, I forgot that there was Dennis's question, which had to do with security of journalists, which I think Yvonne should answer, given the Philippines' precarious situation in terms of journalists being attacked online as well as offline.
I think that's part of education that we need to acquire as journalists, how to keep safe. And that means knowing the laws, knowing how to keep safe physically, and of course, digital security. But we're also lucky in the sense that in the Philippines, we are, because of recent developments, a lot of training is going into digital security. So that's one thing that we have to arm ourselves with. Speaking of security, digital security, we don't get threats at VERA Files. We just get like very nasty remarks. But we've been victims of malware attacks since we stepped up our fact checking. Sometimes I don't want to think there's malice in it. Maybe there is. Maybe it's me. We're just stupid. We don't know how to step up our own right? Security online. So we try to address that. Huh? We don't make a lot of noise, but we do try to fix that also. But there's something I also, aside from the threats, those are real in the Philippines. Do you know that my team of 9 people, the 9 fact checkers, we started out with people being given bylines for their fact check items. After a few months, because of the online threats, they came to me and said, is it okay if we don't have bylines? And that's rather unusual for a journalist not to want bylines. But that's okay because it's collaborative work, and we still list all the members of the team. It's just that it makes them feel more vulnerable because of the threats on social media.
I'm glad you put safety on the table, because I think it's not an experience that's unique to the Philippines. I think, well, in several countries, Indonesia, India, I can think of, where, I mean, when we talk about the battle between truth and falsehood, there are real dangers that journalists face in telling the truth. And it's not just from government and big business, it's increasingly coming from the ground, which I think reminds us that part of the ecosystem that needs to be fixed is just basic safety that can only be provided by the state ultimately. Yeah? Okay, that's right. Back there.
Hello, I'm Me from Vietnam, and as I have seen so far, there's all the discussion has been about the fact-checking and reinvent journalism. However, so it seems for me that it's only suitable for the big newsroom. For the small and new established newsroom, for example, if you publish the news with good quality, but there are no audience, how you can survive when there is a fact that fake news can draw a lot of audience, especially the clickbait? These are my questions.
Okay. Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Lau from the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. My question is kind of similar, but it goes to Charlie. So you just raised a very interesting point about, journalists have to be more sort of engaging with the data and the comments of your readers. But on the flip side of the whole thing, it's very easy for a newsroom to be entrapped in, going after click rates and stuff by publishing clickbait stories as well. So can you sort of illustrate your point with an example that how we can, as a reporter or an editor, by reference to the data and comments that we've got, build a better relationship with our readers? Thanks.
Let's take those 2 questions first. Charlie?
I think Yvonne can talk more about the fact-checking in a way, but the way I see fact-checking is that every journalist should be a fact-checker. So it doesn't matter if you're a freelancer or a tiny specialist newsroom of 3 or 4 people, everyone should be a fact-checker. It's not your responsibility to clean up the internet, perhaps, but at least your little bit of it you can get right. And I think we're seeing, organizations develop in a kind of ecosystem of specialist fact-checking, verification agencies, and so on. It's partly becoming the role of the news agencies to do that, for example. And it's also a responsibility of other civil society. Around a terror incident, for example, it's partly the job of the police to make sure that facts are put out in the public domain that have been checked, and to counter fake news around those kind of events. In terms of, it's a slightly different question, the one about how you use data. And data I use in the broadest sense of, trying to understand what your reader is about. It could be looking at comments, although comments are so unrepresentative that you shouldn't take them to be too significant. Then there's the actual statistical data which shows, you know, who is reading your material, when are they reading it, where are they reading it, when are they sharing it, why are they sharing it, who are they sharing it to. That speaks volumes about the way that people value your work. But then there's another bit of sort of engagement and data. One bit of engagement which is absolutely fabulous, you may not have heard of this, but it's called getting out of the office, meeting people, going to places that you don't normally go to. Don't bother with the press conference, you know, go and deliberately seek out communities that you don't normally talk to find stories that you don't normally do, you know. So I think that's the kind of audience engagement and audience data analysis. And some of it's digital, you know, don't spend your time just looking at your rivals' websites. Go and look at some specialist stuff. Go and look at, you know, kind of social media like in the UK, there's Mumsnet. You know, these are gold mines, not just of stories, but understanding public attitudes. One little example from the last UK election, it turned out afterwards that fox hunting was one of the most significant issues in making people switch their vote. You did not see fox hunting mentioned once in mainstream media. One exception was ITV News, who had actually used, and Irene from Google will be pleased about this, they'd used Google Trending, and they had spotted that people were talking about fox hunting all the bloody time. So they did actually pick up on that. So I mean this in, you know, it's not just about the technology, it's about a different attitude, a much more open attitude, recognizing that journalism has changed a lot in the past, and it's got to change now as well.
Can I invite the audience to, since we are reaching the last 10 minutes of our conference, don't feel you have to confine your interventions to questions to the panelists. If you feel that there is something you need to get off your chest, a comment to make about the theme in general, now's the time to do it. Yes, right. Oh yes, please, sure.
For the one who asked the question about small audiences and fact-checking, there are many models for fact-checking. It doesn't have to be done by an NGO or a separate fact-checking organization. Fact-checking can be done right in the newsroom. But what we'd like to see one day is, as Charlie pointed out, fact-checking while you're doing your story. When you know that your source is lying or making a false claim, put it down in your story if you're sure about it and give the hard evidence that would contradict the person. That's what we'd like to see one day. Small audiences. VERA Files is a very small, independent media organization. But I look at the analytics all the time so that I know who the audience is. And I know for a fact that we have not been reaching, let's say, the lower class, lower economic classes, people who speak Filipino, because all our posts are in English. So starting in July, what we did was we made a conscious effort to also translate the post to Filipino, and we tied up with the second biggest tabloid so that it could reach the audience that we want. I mean, we're not going to get the revenues, right? But at least it will keep us going. People will, I mean, we spread the word. Huh?
I usually hate people who use questions to make comments, but just because the security issue is so important, I'm just gonna make a point to say that Google actually has a couple of initiatives to help newsrooms cope with these kinds of security issues. So the first one is called Project Shield, and basically you get to use Google servers to help protect you from DDoS attacks. So those are distributed denial of service attacks. So you know when you have people start or hackers or whoever start attacking your website and then the website goes down. Project Shield can actually help to protect your website. And it's available for free for news organizations and for NGOs. If you are interested in that, please contact me and I can put you in touch with the right people. The other project that we have is something called Perspective, which is actually using machine learning to help to moderate comments. A lot of news organizations now, they just don't even do comments at all because it gets so negative. But this initiative is actually leveraging machine learning to help allow you to keep comments going, but also to take out toxic comments without having to have a manual person read through them. So again, if you're interested in either of those products, which are available for free, let me know. So.
Thanks very much. That reminds me of Ulrich's slide earlier showing the superheroes Project Shield. Yeah. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Good afternoon, I'm Sophia from China. When we talk about the fake news, actually I saw a lot of words like educate the public or prepare the public. It feels like a little bit elitism. Feels like we are a little bit superior to them. But when I read a lot of articles, I read the comments too. And the comments sometimes are more interesting, and the readers are actually quite smart. So what should be like the more reasonable or more suitable relationship between the journalism or media and the readers? Are they our God? Should we serve them, or should we feed them, or should they be educated? So three of you or four of you are welcome to answer the question. Thank you.
Junni?
I wanted to pick up on the point of what Prof. Chua said about news literacy, because I think we've spent a lot of time talking about how to be a good journalist, and everybody here really tries their best to be a good journalist. But on the other side, and then to pick up what Mi Huang said about small audiences, it's really worthless if there's nobody to read view our work. So news literacy, I think, are there good examples of these sort of initiatives? I know I've heard of schools, programs for schools, for example. We have, I think, someone who provides programs for schools right in this room. I think Cherian and I think Straits Times in Singapore have done work in children's news for children as well. Wonderful has a young reader program. I think Java Post also has a very good program for engaging teenagers. But I guess we're always talking about our viewers today, our readers today, but what about the readers of tomorrow as well? How are we, are there other interesting initiatives to engage and cultivate the readers of tomorrow? The other thing is marketing. I think we like to say that our work stands for itself, it speaks for itself, but really, I think in the crowded market these days, we really need to sort of maybe up our game in terms of marketing ourselves. We don't like to do that. I mean, we really are not the marketing types, but I think in this day and age, maybe we could consider something like that as upping the marketing efforts. A few years ago, I saw a TV ad campaign for the Mumbai Mirror, and it just blew my mind, because here's a newspaper, but going into television, and I know there's a fellow here from the Mumbai Mirror, but I must say I was very impressed by something like that, television being used by a newspaper, and the stories, it's basically amazing storytelling. They're beautifully filmed. You watch them, and they really tug at the emotions and about the whole values, all the values that journalism talk about. They're available on YouTube if anybody wants to watch them. I have nothing to do with the Mumbai Mirror, by the way.
Hi, I am Ivy from the Philippines. I currently work in digital news. One of the problems that I've seen as our organization is mainly a broadcast organization, and it's pressured to deliver for profit because we're supporting hundreds of thousands of employees around the country and all that. How do journalists really, for example, in the Philippines, in the climate that we have now, how do we reboot how we do journalism to fight for freedom? Because right now on digital, we look at audience data, we look at data from readers of other publications, all these surveys about the president's popularity, and people keep calling for, well, not everyone, but there are many calls now in the Philippines for free press to be dismantled and for people to just rely on state media, which presents only one side of the coin. The administration has actually taken steps toward this because they now ban mainstream media from covering some presidential events and only allow state media to come in and cover. I'm seeing this trend across Asia. Like there's this trend to make people only see one side of the coin. How can we reboot our coverage to comply with the pressure to make people read us? Because, and also considering that our platforms our channels are getting fewer. For example, in our case, while we have everything, apps, website, mainstream media, traditional media, to carry our news, a lot of people are going towards, let's say, Facebook in particular, because it's free. People in the Philippines don't have a lot of money to access all these beautiful channels that we prepare for them. Thank you.
Okay, great range of comments and questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask the panel members to pick their favorite one to answer. It could be, and there's some very broad questions that I think are good to chew on. There's the question about whether we are underestimating our audience and we're being too elitist. There's a question about does journalism sell itself, or do we need to do more to sell journalism as well as to cultivate a new generation that understands and appreciates our work? There's a question of how do we deal with governments that are just bypassing the media and convincing the public that actually they can do without us. It's your pick. Alan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I like that question by Junie about marketing, and I think that actually ties in a lot with what Ivy was saying about overall coverage in a country. You know, the reason why media has been so bad at marketing itself is because we don't know what makes us different. If you had to run an ad campaign for your company today, what would it sound like? You would be using statements and you'd be saying things that all your competitors would be able to claim as well. Right? So as an industry, we've not been able to differentiate the way we write, the way we cover stories, the way we assemble a story using multiple elements. Our coverage at the end of the day is diluted, it's commoditized. When it's out there in the real world, it looks exactly the same like everyone else's. And that's why, to Junie's point, marketing is important. I absolutely agree on that. I also want to call out the point that we need to know what makes us different. And we don't spend enough time really trying to distill that. We're always going on about, our stories carry the truth and the fact, and we spend more time fact-checking our stories. We have better coverage than anyone else. Like, these things don't matter to most people who read us on Facebook, right? And I think this is also, to Ivy's point around what's going on in the Philippines. The regular audience can't tell between state media and private media. It makes no difference to them at all. And this is something, again, it's a problem that we solve with marketing. But it's really a business problem about how we run our companies and who are we trying to reach, what is our mission, how do we do it differently.
Thank you. Yvonne?
The value of media literacy in general and news literacy in particular has been acknowledged, that has been proved to be useful to the public. So I don't think it's really underestimating them. We're just giving them the tools, we're just helping them out to navigate, the maze of the different platforms and the information, the overabundance of information that's out there. So when we talk of educating the public, I think for all of us, we did emphasize that we're focusing on media literacy and news literacy.
I'll try and elegantly combine all three answers in one sentence, which is that, yes, obviously, I work at a university, so I think education is a great idea. And yes, people ought to be taught more in schools about their media lives. Although, frankly, how much do you honestly remember about what you were taught in school about anything? So, in fact, it's got to be an active learning process, and fake news has been one of the best teachers for the public. It's made them aware that journalism can sometimes deceive. But the people who do have to work hardest on literacy are actually journalists. They have been trained and brought up in a culture of creating journalism without thinking about why and how it's consumed. And if they can discover that engagement, then they'll discover their purpose. And that's part of the marketing exercise. I agree utterly with what Alan said there. The marketing exercise, which says not only do we have the tools to make our content literate, but we have created content that people should actually care about. And that brings me to the Philippines question, which I'm entirely unqualified to speak about. And I have enormous respect for the journalists in places like that that are trying to do a decent job on behalf of the public. But I suspect part of the answer to it is being much more explicit in our journalism about how everything we do is of some value. It doesn't have to be a dramatic political expose, but just how every part of our journalism has value, not just financial value, but human value, social value to the citizen. And then at least we stand a chance of not only earning a living, but having a place in a more democratic society.
Thank you very much. Before I invite the audience to show their appreciation to the panel, I'd like to express on behalf of the audience and guests our appreciation to the organizers. In the past, I was involved in the organization of the Asia Journalism Forum. This year, I'm a guest, and only because, Carol and Alan asked me to be the keynote speaker. I know how difficult it is to put this together, so out of charity I said, yes, I'll be your backup speaker if you can't find anyone better. And then they were too polite to disinvite me, so I remained the keynote speaker. And I do want to congratulate them as well as Vani and the entire team at IPS for putting together such a stimulating program and a wonderful selection of speakers. So thank you very much. And thanks to this great wrap-up session and our speakers on the panel as well.
Cherian, thank you everyone. We are running on very good time, so please bear with me. I promise that we'll end before 5:30. So I was planning the closing remarks. As I was planning the program, I was so happy and excited that we managed to find all the moderators, the great speakers, and I realized that I didn't think of anyone for the closing remarks. So I guess I will have to make my best attempt to do so, but I thought of doing it in a reverse way. So I'll start with the most maybe mundane. First of all, to help us, really, we do take your feedback very seriously. At the back of your front cover, you will see a very simple feedback form. We would really appreciate if you could fill it in, either leave it with our colleagues or leave it at the table before you leave the ballroom. That applies to our visiting journalists, our speakers as well, and our chairs. Number two, each of you have a gift to take home with you. They're all the same, so no need to choose, and we hope you like it. Number three, just to echo Cherian's thanks, I just really want to thank some people who made this possible. Number one, when putting together the forum, we didn't do it on our own. So I wrote to Alan and I wrote to Cherian, and they gave extremely useful suggestions and recommendations. So thank you, Alan, and thank you, Cherian. Number two, we would like to thank my colleagues from the admin team and the public affairs team, and Sean, who helped curate, many of these speakers as well, and Valerie. Also to Power Bank, small but powerful, and by that I mean Vani. Thank you, Vani, very much. Wouldn't be able to do this without you. Okay, and thank you for the speakers, some of whom flew literally thousands of miles to get here. So finally, this is just my attempt to close. Starting from Cherian's keynote last night, clearly the forum has broadened our contemplation and our discussion of fake news, and to think about beyond fake news to disinformation and misinformation. It has broadened our thoughts to, beyond the current and the day-to-day. So going back to some of the greatest hits that Cherian quoted, as well as some of the 19th century examples that Farish mentioned this morning. So what is clear is that fake news, disinformation are very insidious. It's insidious because, number one, it exploits people's vulnerabilities and insecurities. Number two, it's insidious because it even exploits our very basic human nature, like what Ulrich pointed out. Number three, they're produced by skillful professionals and they're being increasingly well done. So the next big question is, what can we do? So today's panels clearly highlighted many different approaches. It is impossible to provide an exhaustive list of all of them, but essentially one thing that came out is that it is too resource intensive to debunk everything, to fact check everything. So one suggestion that came up from one of the speakers is perhaps we need to focus our attention to more serious matters and to address overlooked but more important hoaxes or disinformation that has pervaded through countries and societies. Number two, is obviously too big a problem for one country or one player to tackle alone. So hence, we talk about, say, what was suggested or recommended by different speakers in panel 3. We have heard about a wide plethora of tools from new products mentioned by Irene and Elvin to what Martino and Zakir had talked about, what they are doing in their newsrooms, in their teams to verify information and verify sources. I particularly like the a point that was made by Sham on what not to do, which is to shut down media and not to engage in propaganda because it aggravates the problem and it increases distrust and increases anxiety among communities and among societies. So at the end of it all, this forum may not have answered all the questions, but I hope that it has cast light on what more stakeholders can do. Thank you.